Hello, I'm David Lockington, Music Director of your Pasadena Symphony, and I'm excited to welcome you to our third program in our spring season of Pasadena Presents. Today's concert will feature the wonderful pianist Gabriela Martinez, accompanied, of course, by Xin-Yi Huang. I'm delighted that our presentations this spring will be featuring larger ensembles and providing work for more of our musicians as we move towards modest private outdoor live events, and I'm hopeful that the Pops will be starting up again in the summer. In the meantime, here are the musicians who are sharing their wonderful gifts with you today. Violinists Amy Hirschberger, Mei Chang, Mark Sazer, Sam Fisher, and Pamela Gates. Violists Susanna Giordano-Gignac and Lynn Grants, and cellists Deborah Colgard, Nadine Hall, and bass Lisa Gass. I'm also thrilled to introduce you to our other featured pianist, Alan Steinberger. Our program is going to feature three deeply romantic works. The first half is all British masterpieces by Gerald Finzi and Sir Edward Elgar. And in the second half, Gabriela will perform the Grieg Piano Concerto. Now, most people outside of Great Britain only know a select few pieces of British music. And the reality is that until about 125 years ago, there wasn't much to talk about. Before Elgar, Europeans dominated the island. Handel was popular for a good chunk of the 18th century. J.C. Bach and Haydn brought classical modernity at the end of the same century. Mendelssohn was a darling of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and then the romantic floodgates opened with Schumann, Berlioz, Liszt, Brahms, Dvorak, and Wagner. Grieg was also on that list, performing for Queen Victoria in 1897, and being awarded honorary doctorates from both Oxford and Cambridge. Musical institutions, however, abounded, and the middle classes were gradually able to embrace not just popular, but church, opera, and concert music as well. To say that Elgar's popularity stemmed from his ability to speak to general pride in the British Empire through pieces like Pomp and Circumstances would be telling a very one-sided story. While deeply patriotic, Elgar eventually lamented his somewhat jingoistic marches as the horrors of World War I unfolded. But grandeur is definitely a part of his voice. But what his breakout piece brought in 1899 was a brilliant call to the imagination. The Enigma Variations paints musical portraits of friends through a theme that is filled with yearning and pathos. Because it's so personal, it's almost operatically dramatic, and we can see the characters blustering, fluttering, and lisping and carrying on. Elgar summarized a Northern European aesthetic for the British. But just as he became immensely famous, another trend suddenly appeared on stage with the music of Vaughan Williams. He and many composers at the turn of the 20th century saw folk traditions being eroded and sought to preserve them through collecting and subsequently using the music. As these kinds of melodies became incorporated into serious music, a unique and different sound was created. A kind of pastoralism was born, which Elgar couldn't have birthed. Elgar's Victorian-era Serenade for strings predates his first big successes, while Gerald Finzi's Eclogue is a continuation of Vaughan Williams' invention of the romanticized pastoral idyll. Although obviously it's just one aspect of his style, he was also deeply influenced by 16th century English church music. After the First World War, many composers, perhaps because ensembles needed to be smaller, perhaps seeking a kind of simplicity or purity, turned towards the past for inspiration. Some looked as far back as the Renaissance, but many others to the Baroque period. Finzi had a large collection of 18th century scores, and the work you're going to hear evokes his love of that period. He was also taken by the poetry of Thomas Traherne, Christina Rossetti, and William Wordsworth. And the theme of lost innocence at the hands of adult experience captured his imagination. These influences, plus his preference for country living, created the idyll, which is his Eclogue. As you can hear, it's very bucolic in nature and also reflects the classical poetic eclogue form, which is often set up as a dialogue between shepherds. Perhaps the interplay between the piano and the strings reflects this structural device. This was intended to be the slow movement of a concerto, which was never finished, but he was happy for it to be a standalone piece. From about 1927, when he was 26, it took him over 20 years to refine, by which time in his 40s he'd become a mature composer of many choral works. His later clarinet and cello concertos have also become particularly popular works. The idyll is tinged with sadness as lines mingle and part. In Finzi's youth, he lost 3 brothers, his father at age 8, and a mentor, Ernest Farrar, who had been a pupil of Stanford, who said that Finzi was shy and had the soul of a poet. In a way, the climax of the piece is an understated moment as the piano plays alone. The sparseness and the quasi-blue note create a unique poignancy which feels very personal. The first performance was on the 27th of January 1957, 4 months after his death from Hodgkin's disease, at the Victoria and Albert Museum with Kathleen Long as soloist and the Kalmar Orchestra conducted by John Russell. Like Finzi's Eclogue, Elgar's Serenade was written before he achieved great success. In 1889, he married Caroline Alice Roberts, a major general's daughter who disinherited Alice for marrying below her station. In dealing with Elgar's changeable nature, she wrote, "The care of a genius is enough of a life work for any woman." Prior to this, Elgar was running around the west of England near Worcester, playing the violin in orchestras, even under Dvorak for one concert, and directing different ensembles. One was an orchestra of orderlies at the so-called Worcester and County Lunatic Asylum in Powick, which is just 3 miles outside of Worcester. And the one the Serenade was written for was the Worcester Ladies Orchestral Class. Elgar conducted the private premiere in 1892. To help augment his income, he was a church organist, taking after his father, and also taught violin to the blind children of aristocrats. Like Finzi, who spent some time in London and returned to the country, Elgar attempted to break into the London scene in the early 1890s, but things didn't work out for him. He got very close, but a critical reading of his works planned at Covent Garden was sidelined when Sir Arthur Sullivan, of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, walked in and took over to read something of his own. And when he found out later from Elgar, he was mortified. Elgar returned to the country to lick his wounds and write some large-scale works for the festival choirs in the English Midlands, and regroup before the Enigma Variations launched him in 1899. The Serenade fits into the category of an occasional salon piece. It has a kind of Victorian charm with only hints of Elgar's quixotic temperament. It was apparently the first work he was fully satisfied with. The outer movements have a similar breezy quality of observation with subtle twinges of harmony which point but don't always reveal. In a way, the outer movements are the curtains which open in front and close behind the revelation of the poignant slow movement. It's this movement that has an authenticity which is really moving and even haunting at times. It's the clashes between intersecting lines that create the pangs of emotion. When the simple, expansive melody arrives, the openness is all the more touching. there's a feeling of supplication within moments of devotion. In true romantic style, Elgar brings back the first movement to tie the bow in the third, bringing a feeling of closure despite the shortness of the movement. Elgar, who was about 7 years older than Grieg, who was born in 1864, started learning German as a young man so that he could study at the Leipzig Conservatory, which Mendelssohn had established. That plan fell through, and many people have suggested that his originality was secured as a result. Now, Grieg did attend the conservatory in Leipzig on the advice of the famous Norwegian violinist Ole Bull, and said that he left there just as stupid as I entered it, meaning that he didn't learn much about his own original voice, but obviously gained discipline. Even though he was a wonderful pianist, he particularly enjoyed studying the organ. His piano teacher, Ernst Ferdinand Wenzel, was a friend of Schumann, and the concerto that was premiered when Grieg was just 24, bears some similarities to the Schumann. 10 years before the premiere, in 1868, he'd actually heard Schumann's famous widow, Clara, play his hero's concerto. The similarities are mostly superficial because the tone of Grieg's masterpiece is distinctively Norwegian. National identity for most 19th century composers was a driving force, and Grieg successfully incorporates melodic and rhythmic elements in his writing that are derived from folk music. The cascading opening theme itself is emblematic. Likewise, the second theme, which Liszt suggested should be played on the trumpet. Grieg actually tried that on for a while, but reverted back to the cellos. In the last movement, a syncopated, stomping kind of dance called the Halling is memorialized in the vigorous rhythms of the piano. There are apparently traces of Hardanger folk fiddling as well. Like a lot of 19th century works, and I just mentioned Elgar's use of the device, Grieg brings back themes in the last movement from earlier in the concerto, creating a sense of unity and completion. The premiere was meant to be with Grieg playing the piano, but he was away performing in Christiania, which is Oslo today. Edmund Neupert did the honors on April the 3rd, 1869, in Copenhagen, Denmark, with Holger Simon Pauli conducting. Among those who attended the premiere were the Danish composer Niels Gade and the Russian pianist Anton Rubinstein, who had founded the St. Petersburg Conservatory and actually provided his own piano for the occasion. The pianist Neupert was also the dedicatee of the second edition of the concerto, and a man named James Honecker is reputed to have composed the first movement cadenza. The Norwegian premiere in Christiania, Oslo, followed on August the 7th, 1869, which was the same sad year his one-year-old daughter died of meningitis. Grieg's name came on his father's side from Scotland, related to the clan Gregor. After the famous 1764 Battle of Culloden, his ancestors moved to Norway. Here are a few random facts. Grieg, like quite a few composers, married his cousin Nina in 1867. And also, the great Canadian pianist Glenn Gould's mother was a Grieg, making him a first cousin twice removed. Grieg and Tchaikovsky became quite good friends, and there's a famous encounter between Tchaikovsky and Brahms, which was awkward because Tchaikovsky walked into a friend's place in Leipzig where a rehearsal of Brahms' trio was taking place, and Brahms was there. But Tchaikovsky couldn't stand Brahms' music. Tchaikovsky, who thought that Brahms was a giftless bastard, managed to keep his mouth shut, and the evening was saved by the arrival of the Griegs, whose sunny disposition created a space in which Tchaikovsky and Brahms learned to appreciate each other, eventually becoming quite friendly. So the evening turned out well in the end. As a national treasure, Grieg was given a stipend at retirement age, and he built a magnificent house, which has become the Grieg Museum. He died of heart failure at age 64, having suffered poor respiratory health most of his life. His funeral drew close to 40,000 people. He had achieved for Norway what Sibelius had also achieved for Finland. Grieg made some of the earliest piano recordings in 1903. Here is part of his Norwegian bridal procession, played by the composer. Thank you for taking the time to tune in to this little talk, and I hope you enjoy this rich program of tuneful, romantic music.